Okay, we're going to continue on with our video lessons that will go in the review packet that you're going to turn in. But before we continue with the next little topic of discussion, I want to go back to the previous one. The last thing or the last video you should have in your review packet are the notes from converting decimals to fractions. And so that leads us now to our next one. And this is dealing with expressions. So this would be kind of like the eighth thing, because the previous was number 7, so this would be the eighth thing. This does not include like the slow study guide, that sort of thing. This is just the notes on different little topics as we move on to our SC Ready test. Okay, expressions. We talked about expressions before we really got into equations, because expressions lead into equations. When talking about expressions, there are several things that you need to be aware of, or different terms that you need to be aware of. The first one is, of course, when you think of expressions, hopefully you're thinking of variables. So the first thing would be variable, or variables. And let me do this. Let me make it a little bit smaller here. So the first word is variable, or variables. And variables are, in our case, letters that represent an unknown value. All right, that leads us now into terms. Terms are separated by addition and subtraction signs. Okay, before we go on, I do want to give a couple examples of some variables. So, example would be like x, y, n. Terms, example of a term would be like 4. Could be 5x, or see, in this case, let me go back to the x. So let's say you have 3x plus 5. Okay, that has two terms. The two terms are the 3x and the 5. All right, so let me go ahead and I'm going to highlight these before I go any further. So you need to know what variables are. You need to know what terms are. And with terms, let me talk just a second about 3x. You should know that 3x represents 3 times x. So if you had a value of x, you could substitute it in and then solve for this expression 3x plus 5, which would mean 3 times whatever x is plus 5. All right, next thing, or next term, you need to be aware of what coefficients are. Let me go down here. Let me get a little bit smaller one. Coefficients. Coefficients are the numbers directly in front of the variable. I shouldn't say numbers because it's only one thing. An example here would be 5n. Our coefficient in this case would be just that 5. All right, so let me highlight this. So coefficients are the number directly in front of the variable. Okay, next thing. Would be constants, or a constant. Again, let me make that one a little bit smaller. A constant is nothing more than just a number that does not have a variable with it. A number without a variable. And that would be an easy example. Example would be 4, 5, 2. Could be a fraction, 1/2. Could be a decimal. 0.5. It could be a negative number. So you get the idea. So constants are just numbers because the value of a number does not change. That means it's constant. All right, I'm going to highlight that in just a minute, but I'm going to go on to the next thing. Combining like terms. All right, combining like terms. When we combine like terms, we're going to either add or subtract terms with the same variables. An example of that would be 5x plus 6n plus 3x. All right, if we can look at that, we have 5x plus 6n plus 3x. You can look at that and you can tell, okay, I've got 5x, which has an x, and that 3x has an x. So those are the same because of the x, the variable x. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the coefficients. We're going to add the 5 and the 3, which gives you 8x. And then all we're going to do is just bring the 6x over. And so that would be our answer. And that should not be anything new for you. So let me highlight this. So we have these 5 terms, and these are pretty important things that you need to make sure that you understand. Okay, so let's now get to some examples of dealing with expressions. We talked about the distributive property. We've talked about factoring. So when we're dealing with expressions, you may have to deal with the distributive property. All right, when we distribute, what we're going to do is we're going to take a number that's on the outside of parentheses. Let me do it like this. 5 times 6x minus, let's say 3y. All right, so we're going to take this 5 right here, and we're going to distribute it by multiplying it with each thing in the parentheses. So what that would then give us would be 5 times 6x, and then 5 times this 3y. Now, some people like to bring that minus sign over, and if you bring the minus sign over, we just have minus 5 times 3y. Some people like to look at this and say, okay, that represents a negative 3y. So some people would do it this way. And I'm going to just kind of do this. Or 5 times 6x minus, or plus 5, because they put a plus 5 because this 5 right here is positive, and then multiply that times a negative 3y. And if you'll notice, if you follow the rules for multiplying and dividing, if I go through this first one, that's going to give me 30x minus 15y. Okay, because a negative 5 times a 3 is a negative 15, so we put a minus sign there to represent minus 15. Now if I do the second one, 5 times 6x, that gives you 30x. And then a positive 5 times a negative 3 is a negative 15, so I put a minus sign to represent my negative. So I just distributed, and I looked at this part right here a little bit different. I brought the minus sign over right here, which gave me 5 minus 5 times 3y. Or I could have just done a positive 5 times a negative 3y. A lot of students like to go with this second method until they get the habit of doing this. So that would be an example of the distributive property. All right, so let's go to the next little concept, factoring. All right, when dealing with factoring, that is the reverse or the opposite kind of the distributive property. So let's take an example of what I mean by that. So let's say we have 12x plus 6. What I want to do is, I'm going to put over here, I'm going to find the least common multiple. I'm sorry, the greatest common factor. I'm getting it mixed up. Greatest common factor. So if I find the greatest common factor, I'm going to find the GCF of 12 and also the GCF of 6. So if I list the factors of 12, that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. Because, let me widen this, because 1 times 12 is 12, 2 times 6 is 12, 3 times 4 is 12. So if I do the same thing with 6, I want to find the factors or the numbers that multiply to get 6. I know 1 times 6 is 6. I know 2 times 3, and I already said 6, so I put that there. So those are my factors. And what I want to do is I want to find my common factors. So my common factors for 12 and 6 would be 1, 2, 3, and 6. So which one's my greatest? It would be the 6. So that's my GCF. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that GCF and we're going to put it on the outside of a set of parentheses. So I'm going to take that 6 and put it on the outside of parentheses. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take each one of these terms and divide it by 6. So 12x divided by 6, 12 divided by 6 is 2. I'm going to just bring that variable down. 6 divided by 6 is 1, so I put that there, so that gives me 12x plus 6 if I was to go back through and distribute it. So if I was to distribute that, that comes right back to this original answer right there, which is what you want to have. So you can check your work to see if you come back to the original problem. All right? There's sometimes you're going to have a factoring problem that has a variable in the first term, but it will also have a variable in the second term. So let me do an example of that. And before I do that though, let me highlight this. And I did not highlight the previous page, but if you'll also go back and highlight the previous page. In fact, I'll go ahead and go back to it right now and go ahead and highlight it. So if I, whoops, I did not mean to do that. So if you let me highlight this, the distributive property, that's where we take the number on the outside and just distribute it times the number on the inside, or each term on the inside. So if I was to distribute that, and I know I'm just kind of repeating myself, so we're distributing. All right, let's go back now to factoring, and let's do an example where you have more than one variable. So if I factor where I have more than one variable with a term, so let me take 15x y minus, let's say 20y. All right, I want to do the same thing. I want to find my common factor, or my GCF, for both 15 and for 20. So what I'm going to do is figure out what can multiply to get 15. I know 1 times 15, 2 will not. I know 3 and 5 will. If you'll notice, I put my smaller number here, my larger number there, and I just kind of work my way in. And then in the middle, I meet and get what I need. All right, so let me move that. All right, so I'm going to do now the same thing for 20. I know 1 times 20 is 20. I know 2 times 10. And I know 4 times 5. And if I do that, I'll just get all my factors. So I'm going to look at my common factors that I have. I have a 1 in common, and I have a 5 in common, so my GCF would be a 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 5 and put it on the outside. But you'll also notice I have 2 variables here, and I have a variable here. If you have a common variable in each term, in this case I have a y and a y, I'm going to take that y and I'm going to put it, or take that variable and put it on the outside. So that's going to basically wipe it away here. Okay, so I'm now going to divide each of the coefficients of 15 and 20 by 5. 15 divided by 5 gives you 3. And I'm going to just bring that x down, so 3x. I'm going to bring the minus sign down. And then 20 divided by 5 gives you 4. So that gives me minus 4. So my factored answer for that particular example would be 5y with 3x minus 4 in parentheses. And I can go back and check my work. So if I check my work and I now distribute it, 5y times 3x, that gives you 15xy. And that 5 times that minus 4, or 5y times that minus 4, that would give you that negative or minus 20y. So I've checked my work and I can see that I have the right answer. From these initial kind of problems, you work several different types of problems. So let me now give you an example of the type of problem that you would see. All right, so let's say we have this square here. And let's say, actually, let me do this. Let me say this is a rectangle instead. So let me change that. Let me make it that way. And let's label that 2x, and let's label that 2x plus 4. So if you'll go ahead and copy this down, so that this will be in your set of notes, and y'all can draw this easy rectangle. And if I want to know the perimeter, all right, let me turn the board on and off. As we all know, the perimeter of a shape is the distance around it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to pick up with this problem in the second video, or the next video. So let me go ahead and write perimeter here. So we'll pick up with this in my next video.